Today, on our episode of 92,000 Hours Changemakers season, we are joined by Mark Shreve. I first met Mark during the first year of the pandemic. We met over Zoom and we maintained a relationship online in that time period. We've remained in contact since that initial call, and in each conversation, I learn more and more about his path. In this podcast, Mark references the many mini chapters of his life. He started his career in higher education fundraising 20 years ago, which he calls the simpler times, and he has mostly worked in higher education ever since. Part of Mark's higher ed career was devoted to international education that took him to Italy for 5 years. And it was there that he developed the idea to start his own pasta company, which he did. And it's something that Mark talks about as a pride point that sticks with him. For the past 7 years, Mark has served as managing director and principal of Education Advisory Board, EAB, a firm that is devoted to higher education. And it's there that he develops partnerships designed to support university fundraising across the United States and sometimes across the globe. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Mark, and it's going to be a great conversation. To start off the podcast, I want to start with my first question that I ask everyone, which is, if you remove anything related to work, or sports, or religion, or research, or maybe volunteerism, what are you most proud about yourself as a human being, and why?
Great question. I also love that we started our relationship on Zoom, which is really challenging to do, Annalisa, but we've kept it going, which is great, and have, of course, seen each other in between those meetings too. What am I most proud of? Don't really have the sports trophy, so I won't be mentioning those anyway. I think what I'm most proud of when I look back on the past 40 some years is that I haven't always taken the conventional path. And I think when I was growing up, I expected to certainly follow some sort of conventional path, and maybe not always from my own dynamic interest to take a leap, but others may have pushed me or influenced me, or there's a bit of a trust to it. But I've had a lot of mini chapters, right? So I have a former colleague who used to mock that he would keep my address in pencil because I was moving all the time. But throughout all those different changes of address, I was still sort of weaving something together. And looking back now, I realize that there's a real value, of course, in changing your scenery, changing your career, changing your job within that, because you learn from each different chapter. So I see some other friends and colleagues, and it's not for everybody, but for me, it's made me, I think, a much smarter, stronger, more confident, more interesting person, because I've been able to sort of test what it is I really want to do and how I want to live.
That's amazing. And I think it would be interesting for people, especially young people who are still trying to figure out what they want to do and how they want to live. How did that inform you? Did you know as you were doing this that it was going to land in something that made sense for you, or were you creating meaning along the way?
You're not supposed to know. I mean, I think there are those who perhaps know they always want to be a doctor, or they always want to be a lawyer. But it doesn't mean you're only a doctor or a lawyer. And that was also never me, because I always found something else interesting. Like, oh, I met Annalisa. She has this job. That sounds interesting. I could probably do that too. So my first career out of college was to be a fundraiser. And I had no idea that occupation ever existed growing up, but stumbled upon it as a student caller, like many of us do, and see that there is, something of interest to that role. But I didn't stay long, right? I was that cliche of the person who took a first job in annual giving and then left after 18 to 24 months. And I stayed in and around higher ed for 20 some years, but I also took some other paths away from it too. There's some things that I've done too in the past 20 years where I knew probably wouldn't pay off, or I knew wouldn't be long-term paths, but there's still value in that. And I think looking back on the professional elements of it, those are the actual vocations I think were most interesting, right? The pride points.
That's interesting. I love it. I hope we get into some of the details of those. And I'm interested in the theme of our conversation today because I kind of picked it for you, and that is unusual for me. I usually say, here are 10 things that we could focus our discussion on. Which one would you like? And for you, I said, I think we should focus on connection. So I'm really interested in A, how do you feel about that? And B, what does that mean to you, the idea of talking about connection?
I think when you suggested connection as the theme, it is a word that's not always defined
Yeah.
necessarily. We use it pretty often, but I think it's really meaningful. So, one of my skills, and I sometimes hate when people refer to these things as soft skills. One of my skills is to be a great connector, and naturally that comes, I think, from fundraising, or that first job out of college, is to see that there were individuals of this community that were connecting with other individuals and trying to pair them together to achieve whatever they wanted to do. So, student at university, you should meet this alumnus, or alumnus, you should meet this faculty member. There's a real power in that, right? Because there are individuals in our lives, no matter where you meet them, that are going through similar challenges or have similar interests or want to bring their skills together. And I think that that's where great things can happen. I used to joke that if I did not work in my current role, I'd probably be like a greeter at a large retail store, just making sure that people felt welcomed. It just comes naturally. And I think that's also where I get my energy too, is whenever I have to dial into a Zoom and talk to someone like you, that's not tedious, right? That's for me what I love to do most.
Um, do you think in order to be that type of connector, someone like talk to me about the skill of connecting human beings with each other? What does that mean for you? How has that worked? Do you have any examples of it? And why is that fun?
Yeah, I think there are two main things that have to go into this one. I mean, I don't need to make this scientific for something that comes somewhat naturally to some people, but one, I think you have to be naturally curious, right? You have to
Mm,
be asking questions. You have to be a good
love
listener.
that.
You and I could meet for an hour and keep things quite surface level and never go anywhere. But when you and I first met, we were talking about, in the middle of COVID, perhaps a few years ago, we were talking about who was also in your home with you, because you probably had children who were at home from school, or you had pets, or you had family members, or how was your team doing? Because this is a really difficult time to adjust to a new type of work. If you don't ask those kinds of questions, you don't understand really how to connect you with other people. So that's the first thing, is asking better questions. And I even coach myself on that quite a bit, because it's quite easy for us to ask a question. I can get overly excited about your response and then shut down the conversation or take a different direction. I think asking, deeper questions is even more important, which this is your job now as the podcast host. The second piece is you have to, and I hate to use this crass language, but one of my mottos is you have to give a damn, right? Like
I love
you have to care about what Annalisa is going through or cares about, and then also say, "Oh, I think there'd be value in you meeting with somebody else." And I thought that everyone had those skills 20 years ago, but not everyone takes that next step and thinks, "Oh, it'd be of interest that maybe Mark would love to talk to Annalisa because they have similar ideas, and together they could think about maybe a new way of approaching that." But I think those two elements are the most important.
I love that. And I want to go back to COVID because I have this I have this thing that I actually miss COVID, which seems strange, but I loved meeting everyone on Zoom and seeing their lives. Like I had never, it was weird, and I think it seems different from other people, but I had never felt so close to other people than I did when we were all on Zoom because the full humanity of them was often showing up,
Yeah.
and it made me love them more. I wasn't seeing their like curated work persona. I was seeing them, and I miss that.
Yep. I mean, the alternative now, I was on a call the other day where I was presenting virtually into a conference room. And so I'm looking at the screen of a long table. I
Yeah.
can't see anyone's specific
Face.
reactions.
Yeah.
But yeah, early COVID, 4 years ago, I don't even know what was early COVID 4 years ago. There would be times where I'd be speaking to someone like you, and their child would come in, sit on their lap, and we'd say, "Hey, listen, maybe we should just cancel this meeting for the rest of the day." Um, it also depends on how you reacted to it. I had to admit that I had
Yeah.
a pretty privileged COVID experience.
Exactly.
I didn't really struggle through COVID. I kept my job. I remained healthy. My family remained healthy. But I was also the one who was planning all the virtual happy hours or the Zoom events to keep different networks together. And after a while, I think that exhausts some people. But for me, I had to fill that void because I wasn't,
Because you're a
traveling to see.
connector.
Yeah, I'm a connector. Exactly right. Exactly right.
Um, how does extroversion play into connection and being a connector in the way that you are? Or does it?
I don't think you need to be an extrovert to be a good connector. Um, because the two elements that I just shared don't require that you are necessarily extroverted, but you have to get energy from people. So for me, this is also where I get my energy. If you ask me what's the ideal weekend plan, it's some sort of social event with a group of people. And so I think that really helps because that means you probably have a greater volume of people you're connecting with throughout, your daily life.
I have friends of mine who are shocked when I tell them that I'm not an extrovert because they think that I get all of my energy from lots of people, but I get all of my energy from deeper connections with a smaller group of people. Like big events are, I can do them, but I don't love them. But I have this story that I went to dinner with a stranger for work, and he was a Harvard Divinity School grad. And I have like this Harvard Divinity School grad who's really good at his like thinking about the future of religion in America. And I was like, and we were at a brew pub in Milwaukee, and I leaned over to him and I was like, "So, what do you think about the death of religion in America? Is that a thing?" And he was like, "We're going to talk about this over beers in this loud restaurant." I was like, how often do I get to have a person like you in front of me over beers? I would like to have like a deeper conversation. And I feel like that encapsulates me a lot. And I'm interested in how does that resonate with you? And as a connector, are you able yourself to, when do you have those deeper connections and what does that look like for you?
I would imagine in your role, Annalisa, like the big events aren't required to be successful, right? I mean,
Correct.
if you are looking at connecting with an individual one-on-one, that doesn't happen in a room full of 500 other people, right? It happens when you actually are implying to this other person across the table, "Hey, I know something about you. I'm interested. I can add something to this conversation. I can challenge you." And I think that also shows a level of respect for that other individual, right? You actually came to that conversation not prepared to talk about what you wanted, but rather something that interested them, which is what it's all about. I mean, that's exactly what's going to make you successful in your world. Now, talking about that, I forgot about your initial question.
How do you engage in deeper connections with people? What does that show up like for you, both uh, as a connector, but also professionally or personally? What is that? What does like real connection feel like or look like in your life?
Hmm. That's a tough question. You're stumping me here because it can look like different things. The reason why I'm pausing here is because I think what it means to me is also different than what it means to other people that are on the other end, right? There's a
Yeah, yeah,
natural partnership to this.
yeah.
So some folks in my life just need a quick check-in of consistently, are you getting a text from me? Are we sharing enough Instagram videos back and forth that really are somewhat surface, but shows that sort of
I'm thinking of
Heather?
them.
What's that?
Or that shows that you just are thinking of them, that they're in
That's
your
right.
mind. Yeah.
That's all it takes. Other people that require you to really show up. And so we have certain friends that perhaps, maybe get more different treatment than others, but hopping on a plane sometimes and going to see them. I even make a very concerted point since I've moved to the East Coast, a lot of my friends and family and previous networks are in the Midwest, on the West Coast. We travel quite a bit because moving here and not seeing those individuals is just not an option. Like for
Mm.
me, you have to actually be present and, have that quality time together.
How does connection for you differ professionally and personally? What does it mean to be connected in those two different realms of your life?
Luckily for me, my job requires that I feel like we're using the word, connect too often here. My job requires that I maintain relationships with a large number of individuals. But the good news here is that those individuals are also relationship builders and connectors themselves, mostly. So in my current role, where I am working with university partners that are fundraisers, folks like you and Elisa, who have that same ability and interest and drive to connect with other people, it comes somewhat naturally that I can bring my whole self to work. And I actually love the opportunity that we travel quite a bit for work, and nothing really can replace those in-person conversations. I mentioned before the boardroom example, right? And if I am traveling to see you and meet with you and your team, and I'm spending 90 minutes in that boardroom presenting, that's not where I get my energy, right? I'd much rather meet you for coffee beforehand, or just that 2-minute walk down the hallway from the boardroom or presentation room, conference room to the parking lot is where that moment really occurs. Right. And so I think even that's the thing that was missing in COVID, is that we can present all we want to for 60 or 90 minutes, but it's that moment of, was that productive for you? Do you think your team really enjoyed that? Would that be energizing for them? That's the moment that I need to get from people.
I feel that. I do the same thing when I'm speaking in front of people, which I really like to do. It is that the reciprocity from the group, and you can tell if people aren't interested, and you can also tell when they are. And it feels great when you're having that experience, which leads me to thinking a lot about moving the discussion a little bit from connection and connecting, but to like I think there's something that I want to get at here with you with that has to do with authenticity. What I nearly called my consulting practice Authentic Connections years ago at the beginning because I was so intent on how important authenticity was to honest to goodness connections rather than surface level. Um, and yet at work we need surface level, and sometimes even in our personal lives we need surface level connections too. So I guess for me, I'm really interested in hearing from you about where does authenticity play for you in the role of connecting and then in the next stage of relationship building.
I have to make a confession. I'm glad you didn't name your business Authentic Connections, because I think that
That would be silly. I get it. I know.
it's for somebody who feels like they have genuine relationships, by putting a name on that or a word on that seems almost least authentic, or less
Yeah.
authentic than it was. I think so we were talking about this in the context of my current role. And when you are a connector, there's a lot of give and take. And I think the authentic piece of it comes in the fact that you can't always be taking, right? You have to genuinely be showing that you care about building value in whatever that relationship is, whether it's a friendship, a intimate relationship, a professional relationship. And I can't always be calling upon you and asking for something in return without giving something to you that's of value as well. Whether it's, hey, I thought of you and I read this article, or I'd like to recommend that maybe you consider this candidate for a position, or I think there's a new data set that might be of interest to you. I think showing it in those ways is far more important than just saying words like you value something, right? That goes back to actually defining what authenticity is. People feel it rather than hear it.
What do you think the role of listening is in connecting? And by the way, I just want to say, like, I feel like we talk about listening and yet it's so hard to honestly do.
Mhm.
Do you have any examples of that, or how do you well, I had a conversation with someone just a few days ago where they said that the act of honestly listening is one of the first gifts that we can give another person. And I thought that was just so beautiful. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on listening in this context.
Some folks in my world might say I need some development here as well, but I think there is there's always some practice that one can have here in active listening, and it's true. This goes back to the point about you don't have to be an extrovert to be a good connector, and perhaps it could be, also more challenging for you. One of my other strengths, if you follow Strengths Finders, is to be an activator. So I feel like I'm always emotionally reacting quickly to something. And that could be a very good thing, right? It could be a very positive way. Let's get started on this. I get excited by the energy of other people. That's where I get that's where I get that extroverted energy from. And so it's really difficult for me in some cases to let you have that stage in that moment. And then maybe even more difficult, ask a simple question, lets you have the silence to go deeper. And that's the really challenging piece, is also getting comfortable with that silence that requires people to share more as they're ready and as they feel more trust. That's not always easy. So it's not just listening, it's also becoming comfortable with just that silence and letting people fill it up.
Which is so hard to do. So
So
hard to do.
what's the first thing they teach you as you're a development officer? I remember my first lesson that someone said to me was, after you make your ask, stop talking, right? Because our inclination is just to keep talking and adding into that silence with more noise. Let them fill that space, right? Let them respond and then go from there.
One of my best lessons as a fundraiser has been that, and has also been just approaching what you said at the very beginning, approaching the whole conversation, the whole endeavor with natural curiosity. I think curiosity is like, it's a secret weapon for people who are good at connecting. Because and I don't like the word weapon. I mean, maybe it's like the secret tool, but it is like the thing that you can bring if it's real. If it's not real, people can tell immediately.
Right.
But if it's real and you're honestly curious about the person or about their values or about their interests, it feels so good to have those conversations with people, regardless of if it's in a professional context or a personal one.
Yeah. And sometimes that has to start before the conversation begins. So you do, again, we're going back to your expertise as a fundraiser. You have to, when you are asking someone to meet with you, show them that you
Pay
are
attention to
interested, you
them.
do care, right? Because even before you sit down across from them in that Milwaukee bar that you referenced, they're making a decision whether it's worth their time to share that space with you or not. In my current role, we do a lot of discovery, because it would not be productive if I just came to you all the time and said, this is what we do. Do you want it? Yes or no? I want to figure out what it is you're working on, what specific challenges you have, where we might customize work for you and your team. But a lot of that starts with the way you ask questions. And you can't just give someone a playbook and say, here are the 10 questions to ask. So it's always trying to figure out a framework of how do you keep it broad enough that shows you're caring about that answer, but you're letting them direct you as well. So I have a go-to question if I'm having a cold meeting with somebody, and that is, hey, how are you and the team holding up? Right? Or maybe if it's not professional question, it's, Annalisa, it's been a while. How are you holding up? How are you energized this part of the year? Something simple, because the way that folks can respond to that simple question can take a conversation in a whole different number of directions.
I had that with a client just last week where I said, just a simple, hey, how are you doing?
Yeah.
And the person said, I'm okay. And I was like, ooh, let's dig deeper into what that means. What's good and what's bad that's leading to an okay? What's happening there? And it was a really good question. At the end of the whole conversation, we went back to, okay, how are we feeling now? And is there any difference between the okay? Is it a little better, a little worse? Let's have another check-in. Um,
Here's a sign. Do you feel like you're the person where a lot of people will spill them all their secrets to, or spill
yes,
their stories to?
yes.
Then there's something that's, I think, deep within you too, that is this ability to connect with folks, right? They sense or they feel that you're credible, you're trustworthy, you're interested, and so they're going to share more, right? That's something, like I said, you can't tell people that. They can't hear it, they have to feel it.
I also think that there is uh people will be more likely to really be honest with you and tell you who they are if you're willing to do it first. If you're if you're open enough to be vulnerable and not put on some kind of like a performative, this is who I'm supposed to show up as today, and instead just showing up as yourself, which is so scary. It's really hard to show up as yourself. Especially in a professional context when you're thinking like, I remember that when I'm like, I'm a senior vice president or I'm the president, I still feel the same way and I'm still the same person who was a beginner. I know more things, but I'm still the same person. And when I allowed myself to just be me, it made it easier for me to have other people be themselves too, regardless of any of our places in society. We're all just human.
Yeah, and there's I went through a fellowship experience at my current employer, and we had a session on amplifying your personal brand. And
Mm.
I felt more apprehension about sharing my personal brand than just being comfortable as myself. Those same conversations that were matched with at some point some executive coaching. And the interesting part was that the executive coach will tell you if you're feeling like your personal brand is an exercise to your current role, you're in the wrong role, right? So if I am working through this exercise to share what my personal brand is, and it feels like I'm not ashamed to admit that, or I'm forcing it to fit into this box, then I think that means you're in a good spot.
That's super interesting.
Yeah.
How did it turn out for you?
Well, we talked a lot about being that personal connector, right? And it's internally my role at this company is twofold. One is to connect with our partners and clients and other universities and make sure they have what they need to be successful. But then internally, it's also making sure that we're collaborating so that we're not all going to Annalisa with 10 different solutions. And um, I think that's important too, knowing in higher ed right now, it's having a moment where there are a lot of organizations who are saying, hey, we can help you. Here's the brightest, shiniest thing. And you might not need all those things to something a bit more simple to get that next step. So I think that is certainly as we're talking about connections right now, there's two different focus of that in my role.
I want to talk a little bit about if we move it just a little bit. We've talked about the pro side of how we connect personally and professionally and different ways to do that. But what about that moment when you feel disconnected? And what do you do about it? How have you felt it? What advice do you have?
Sometimes it's healthy, right?
Tell me about that. What does that mean?
Well, right, as we've talked about this, the mutually beneficial relationships that we're talking about here. There's give and there's take, and if it's more give and less take, then at some point, there's a drain on you because I think in my case, maybe for others out there who are listening to this too, your inclination if people are taking is to lean in further, and then all of a sudden you are now sort of exposed in a way. And sometimes cutting that off is healthy. I'm not the best at resetting some of those relationships. Maybe others are. It's also challenging to accept that sometimes people just don't want to connect. There are a lot of folks out there, and that's powerful for them too, who do not feel the need to have these relationships. I've always been the person who's had many relationships at different levels, whereas I have friends who value one or two strong relationships and don't want to know that you have 10 or 20 relationships. And so it's just understanding what people need. And that's okay too. Not everyone's like me, thankfully.
Is there a way when you're feeling disconnected in a relationship that's important to you that you have found a way to reset that connection? Oh, I know you've probably had it in your personal life because we all do. But either one, personal or professional.
I don't think I'm great at this, candidly. And I think I'm probably better at it professionally than I am personally. But I think if we start professionally, the best way to sort of address it is again to reset that. If we're talking now on service, reset that discovery process, right? Go back to that question. Hey, what's going on these days? Or how are you holding up? Something seems different. Or why just okay? And I think maybe if I'm feeling that disconnect, they likely are as well, and either intentionally want to feel that way or are struggling to have someone invite them to share more. Um, and I think I've probably been better at that professionally than I have been personally.
I love that. And I like the honesty that you have about that. Which makes me wonder, are there any people in your personal life that you want to reinforce a connection with? Not that you have to name them, but do you have any that you're like, oh, I now need to reach out to so and so?
No, I feel good about it.
Awesome. That's great.
However, I will say I have classic FOMO that sometimes it's never enough time. And and that's harder because as I said, I've experienced many chapters in my life where I might have moved to different cities. And for someone like me, I don't lose touch with a lot of those
People in
best
those
friends I
cities.
made. So they keep adding up, right? So for instance, I had the fortune of living in Chicago for a couple of years, one of the world's greatest cities. And so I always want to go back to Chicago, see those people. But Chicago's
Have
just one
fun.
stop on the way. Yeah, of course.
I love that. And it makes me think about that because you just brought that up. Talk to me about connections to communities. You've had this fortune of being able to move and live in different places, which also means you have different friend groups, you have like different experiences. Are there, and I'm thinking of different types of communities. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to be connected to a place geographically or to a community of people? Um, for example, people find their own, like this is for lack of a better word. People say like you find your people, you find like wherever you live or wherever you are. Um, Talk to me about that, the importance of those kinds of connections and how to foster them.
We have these we have these conversations a lot in my family. And um how do I put this the right way? I I don't have a formal religion or church community, which is also where I was raised. A lot of folks are raised that way. And I think there's still this traditional expectation is that that's where you find your support network for a lot of folks. Um, what's great is that for those who do not fit into that category, it's easy to find those communities, as you said, whether it's in a local group or geographic group, it's some sort of interest group. This is also where probably your kids and younger folks are finding their people online too. And, I think say I'm generalizing here, but perhaps those of us who didn't grow up online like kids are these days fail to understand what kind of connection that really provides. But it is possible to find these different levels of communities no matter where you go. I was 2 weeks ago, I was back at my alma mater, undergraduate alma mater, for my 20th college year reunion, and was blown away by just the relationships I reconnected with. It took me back to a different time and place. I've been involved with that college for 20 years as an alumni volunteer, but just going back and seeing the group of classmates that I had and hearing about what they've done was really energizing, right? I'm inspired by them, as it was interesting to see how all of us who looked the same and kind of felt the same in that bubble then went in these different directions. But they too had examples of where they found their communities, right? People with different interests and hobbies. Someone was in a sailing club on Lake Michigan. Someone was in the military. Somebody was very active in their church. Somebody had a family. Somebody was single, right? All these different ways that they define their lives. They're finding their own way to fill it with other people.
I'm watching my oldest child do that in New York City, and I have to say that as a parent of a now adult child, seeing them find their people is one of my like, it is such a great joy to watch them find themselves without my influence. It has been like watching her come alive as who she is has been beautiful, and I think it is those connections that she's made, and in some ways, like finding her own chosen community that she feels good in has been awesome.
Yeah. So, what has surprised you? If I can turn the tables here on you, has she done so in a way that's different than you perhaps would have or have expected?
I mean, yes, like I was afraid. Well, as a kid, I was afraid of New York City. I was like, that's a big city. It seems scary. I'm from Utah. What do I know? And I think that people around me led me to that. But as she grew up with that natural curiosity and with an openness to other people and didn't see them with fear and saw them with interest. And she was drawn to New York even when she was like 15 and spent a summer there living with a friend of mine that worked at Goldman Sachs. And she was like, this is where I need to be because everyone's interesting and everyone's different. It's not a homogenous group of people. And I want that in my life. And her friend group is also that. Like, it's not a homogenous group of people. They're all different, but they um honor their differences better than I think I people that when I was her age did, at least where I grew up.
Yeah, I think I hear those stories quite a bit, and I would imagine for somebody who's in their 20s currently, they have the benefit of perhaps a more open mind than even I had 20 years ago. And just think of if she ever has children, what their mind
There,
too,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that gives me energy, right? There's a lot of skeptical news and negative reporting in the world, but hearing those stories makes me excited.
Me too. I feel like we hear about the people connecting with each other or failing to connect because we're afraid of each other, but then um the people that are connecting with each other are finding common bonds in ways that we knew were there. We just didn't experience them enough. So I think it's a great thing. Um, when we were talking about, I'm going to go back to the very beginning and then I'll ask one more question after that. But at the very beginning, when we talked about the podcast itself and how we call it 92,000 hours and the ways that we spend our entire lives, mostly at work, I was really interested in how you have experienced that yourself and what that means to you and how you're trying to find meaning and purpose.
Yeah, I think, Annalisa, I hope that never stops, right? I don't imagine that I will be in this same role until I retire. And I hope not, because that means that perhaps nothing has caught my interest and and put a new challenge in front of me between now and then. I love that you have this podcast that is focusing on the majority of time we spend at work. And I believe I've shared with you before that in my first role out of college, the first year when you're getting into the routine of a 9 to 5 job, I asked a coworker, is this all there is? Every day I come to this space and I wait here until I'm allowed to leave. And then I repeat this. And maybe it was just kind of shooting down that idealism I had, or maybe I was in the wrong role, but it was a shock. And you have to quickly learn that if you're not happy in that space, you can, move around to find and explore other things. You also mentioned, or you asked me earlier, what I'm most proud of. I had a career moment where I even had someone push me further. So in this case, was my mother who said, what's the worst that could happen? Like, what is the absolute worst could happen? And take a risk and kind of push me off the high dive. And in that moment, I decided to start my own venture, sort of my own company, much like you're doing now. And you know what? It wasn't the most lucrative part of my career. It wasn't the most logical part of my career, but it's the thing I'm most proud of because you had to explore that. And so now that I'm back in a more conventional role and I work for another company, I'm so much happier where I am because I decided to come back here as opposed to just being put on the conveyor belt. And I felt like I was forced to be here.
Oh, I love that. That like that moment of feeling like you have your own free will and your own choice and your own ability to create meaning in what you do that in a different circumstance may not have felt as meaningful, but then you were able to give it meaning yourself rather
Mhm.
than having someone above you tell you that it was meaningful.
That's right. It was all on me. And others that decided to help me because of course, as you've heard me say in the past hour, I do nothing alone. um, but it also allows you to just determine what you want, and everything is about some sort of trade-off, not to make it overly simplistic, but I was running a business and realized that the piece that I was missing was interacting with people. And the best part of this business, which had some retail component to it, was trying to sell the product that I was making, but I was spending all of my time making the product. And so therefore the scales were tipped. And in the end, I went back to just being in front of folks in this sort of sales type role, knowing that that's what gave me energy.
I have to tell you, Mark, that you're good at it though. You give the people that you're talking to energy. Like all this time, I feel like I know you and I don't know you. So there's this ability for you to engage with me in a way that feels authentic and like it's a little more than any type of transactional relationship. I feel like you put yourself into those connections so that the people you're connecting with know that they matter as humans, not as a transaction.
That's the best thing you could have said to me. That's great. That really means a lot. But I agree. I felt instantly that we had some sort of connection as well. And it's made the conversations that we've had more productive and more fun. We could be more candid with each other. We can challenge each other.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's how things get done.
Absolutely. That's how we really get things done rather than pretend to get things done. And that's how we
Right.
find meaning and purpose in our work.
That's right.
All right. So I always end the podcast with a specific question about mentors because we've talked about this. None of us get here alone. And whether sometimes people don't even know they're a mentor to you, but we often have mentors. And I'd love to just give you an opportunity to tell me about a mentor that has happened in your life. Is there anybody that you want to honor for their mentorship by mentioning them here?
Yeah, I'll stay on this thread of the time I spent 2 weeks ago back at my alma mater for my reunion. And there were two early career managers that I had that worked in university communications. And at that point, still trying to figure out, I loved this mission-based work, but where do I actually fit into this? And some of the advice I got from the two of those gentlemen was, I'm going to summarize this in some words, is just show up, right? When you just show up at some point, you never know what story you might capture or what angle you might see, but you also don't know what that means to other people. So in your personal life, we're busy. It's difficult to think about, making arrangements to be there for somebody else, but you never know what that might mean for that person. And they'll remember that, whether it's attending a wedding or a funeral or just dropping by. But the same is true at work too, is that if you just show up and you have that natural curiosity, it's amazing where these things go from there. So that's the advice that sticks out of my head the most from that early career mentor that makes a lot of sense now in both work and in life.
I love it. It's the perfect way to close out this podcast because just showing up makes all the difference, and especially in ways that we don't even know. I love that you said that. I'm going to live with that for a while, especially because I'm in a new community and I need to just show up and meet people, find my people here.
They're probably looking for you too.
I love it. Mark, thanks so much for doing this with me and for spending time with me this way. I know that everybody's going to get just as much out of it as I do, and I hope that we can continue to have good conversations over time.
I hope so. This is great. Thanks so much, Annalisa.
Of course, Mark Shreve was a great, great interview. Mark has always been so engaging throughout all of the time that I've known him. And if you'd like to connect with him personally, you can do so. You can definitely do it at his place of employment, EAB. You can find him at eab.com. In fact, when you look for him there, you can find him under their experts page because he is, in fact, an expert. So thanks so much, Mark. You can also connect with him on LinkedIn, and I'm sure he'd love to have more connections. I hope you'll also join us next time, because next time we'll be in discussion with Felicia Maxfield Barrett, who will be talking about subtle radicalism. Felicia is the CEO of the organization called Utah Global Diplomacy. And she will talk about what that means and why we all can consider ourselves citizen diplomats. So I hope you'll join us. I'll look forward to it. See you next time.